Hello, my name is Gunnery Sergeant Mark Jenkins, and this is my colleague Staff Sergeant Hiram Diaz. We're members of the Euphonium section in the President's Own United States Marine Band. We'd like to welcome you to John Philip Sousa Band Hall, the home of the Marine Band here in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to have a mini masterclass on the characteristics of march style. So a lot of times students will come up to us and they'll ask us, how do you play a march and make it really sound like a march? You know, I can play all the notes right, but it's still missing a little something stylistically to make it really sound like the Marine Band or another military band is playing it. And it really comes in handy for auditions as well, when stylistic integrity and correctness are very important. So what we're going to do today is kind of try to quantify some of the unwritten rules that have been handed down from generation to generation of military band musicians orally, so that you can kind of get an idea of what you can do in your practice sessions and performances to really make a march sound like a march should sound. So our format today is basically we're going to take a march apart section by section, and for each different section we're going to have a different excerpt, and we're going to play each of those incorrectly first and then correctly. The first thing you need to know about playing marches is that they're not classical music, at least in the strictest sense of the word. The marches that we play most often, so Sousa marches and Carlisle King marches, by the time they came around in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were really kind of known as pop music or popular music of the day. So they were played in that commercial or popular music style. And so they need to sound apart from, say, a Wagner or a late Romantic excerpt. They need to sound different, and they need to sound singular to a march. And so that's what we're going to be doing today.
To illustrate these march style elements, we chose the music of our most famous band director, John Philip Sousa. In general, Sousa's marches can be broken down into 6 sections. First, the intro, then the first strain, the second strain, the trio, the dogfight or the breakup strain, and then the last strain, which is generally a recap of the trio. Many sections of the march are marked repeated, and conductors will sometimes change the instrumentation to get a different color out of the ensemble or to change the volume. Remember to keep playing with the march style elements that we'll discuss today, even though the volume changes.
So we're going to go ahead and play the first excerpt for you now. It's going to come from the Glory of the Yankee Navy March by John Philip Sousa. We're going to play the introduction and the first strain for you. Now both of us are going to be playing unison most of the time because it's the same part. There's a little divisi, but we wanted to show you what a euphonium section in a professional ensemble does in terms of matching style across a section and intonation. So here's the incorrect example first. All right, so obviously that was a pretty tame example. Not much stylistic nuance in that, and so to speak. Basically, it was just the plain notes on the page. We did the dynamics. We tried to play with a nice sound. We tried to play in tune across the section, but it really didn't have that characteristic march feel. So let's talk about first the sections that we covered. So the introduction and the first strain. When you're dealing with a Sousa march, the introduction is kind of the fanfare for the piece. It introduces all the great material that's going to follow. So when you play it, it should be played with a real marcato articulation and marcato style, like a fanfare. The first strain in a Sousa march is the exact opposite. It has a real off-the-bow sound if you were a string player, a giocoso sound, so a joking, light, jovial sound. And usually there's a dynamic shift. There's a decrescendo going from the introduction to the second strain, just so you can get a very light, very bouncy feel. Not marcato, not bombastic at all. In terms of general guidelines for the music, stylistic guidelines, the first one is always play the short notes sempre staccato. So in this march, you have quarter notes, eighth notes, and 16th notes. They always need to be played very short. And sometimes it's very difficult to express to students how short is short. But remember, you're in the back of the ensemble, and by the time it gets out to the audience, it's going to sound a lot longer than when you played it. So it needs to be very short, very clean. Also, you're playing in tandem with a lot of the sections, again, so it needs to be nice and crisp. The second rule is separating and accenting all syncopations. So you see in the third bar of the first strain, da-da, da-da. We want to separate all those notes. We want to make the 2 notes on either side short, and we want to accent the syncopated note. Anything that gives us a break from the monotonous 1, 2 downbeat is always preferable, and we always need to bring that out of the march. A third rule is to lean on the lower neighbor notes when you have them, especially in a Sousa march. So I'm talking about the fourth bar in the first strain, dee da da da. That's such a calling card for Sousa. He has it throughout all of his marches, and when you accentuate that little chromatic neighbor tone, it really adds a lot of character, and it really kind of puts Sousa's stamp on the march. So it's stylistically very important to do. And lastly, and this is very important as well because this comes up a lot in marches, is always double dot the dotted A 16th note figures or dotted quarter note figures when you have a dotted quarter note and eighth note in cut time. So you want to delay the second note in that grouping, dun da dum. And what that does is when you delay and de-emphasize the second note, the 16th or 8th note if it's a cut time march, you're accentuating the following downbeat. So not only do you get a strong downbeat, you get a nice momentum across the bar line. So all those rules are a really good starter in terms of the introduction and first strain.
Now let's apply these rules and play through the intro and the first strain again in the correct style. Glory of the Yankee Navy is a great example of making sure you're aware of their context. In the second strain, following the first strain, we have a jocoso counter melody still for the first 8 measures in the euphonium part. Then you join in with the trombones and trumpets, playing in the marcato style that is typical of second strains. Speaking of second strains, we decided to go and play the Royal Welsh Fusiliers to display this marcato style. Listen now as we play this incorrectly. When playing second strains, as we just did, it can become very thick, heavy, and lack general direction. Also, it can really drag the tempo down with all this rich playing. Second strains should actually be played much more marcato. A very militaristic feel will make it so much more exciting. To achieve this sound, it's a simple rule that I like to use, LLSS. Long notes loud, and the short notes soft. And those short notes should always lead to the long, loud notes. A fantastic way to approach this music also is to play with attack and decay style on the long notes. Visually, this would look like a rooftop accent over the longer notes with a small diminuendo over each one of them. This gives the music a very bouncy, heavy downbeat feel, but also lifts the music and gives it forward energy. Remember that the dominant voice in this section is the trombone section. So the euphonium section, we really just support them. We add depth to the sound, not any length.
Okay, so the next section we're going to be talking about is the trio strain. Another nickname for that is the aria strain. And in a Sousa march especially, the trio strain is the most melodious of all the different sections of a march. And so because of that fact, there are stylistic characteristics that come into play that don't really come into play in any other section of the march. So what we're going to do again is play it through for you incorrectly, and then we'll talk about those. All right. So that was without any kind of stylistic nuance added, but a lot of vibrato. And of course, as euphonium players, sometimes we have the temptation when we get a nice melody like this to really turn on the vibrato machine. And we have to remember, like Hiram said, you always have to pay attention to the context, what everyone else is doing around you while you're playing. And in a Sousa march especially, he really uses the euphonium kind of as a utility man to double different sections. And in this trio, the main timbre that he wants to hear are the clarinet sections and the reeds. So you want to make sure that that timbre is the dominant texture, and you're just basically adding kind of resonance to that sound. So excessive amounts of vibrato will basically sound like an intonation problem, not necessarily an expression tool. So in terms of stylistic characteristics, because this is really a nice melody, you want to make sure that the phrasing is very clear, so plan your breaths accordingly. Also, a lot of students really don't know what to do with this part of the piece because the melody isn't really wide in terms of intervals. It just kind of stays in the same tessitura. But you can still bring out the contours of the phrasing using dynamics. So just very simply, as the contour of the phrase rises, just match your dynamics accordingly. As it falls, just decrescendo slightly. And that'll give a really nice contour for the audience to listen to. And also, even though we've mentioned it previously, this has some lower neighbors in it. A lot of people kind of shy away from the accents that are marked in the part because it doesn't really seem to fit within the context of this nice melody. But remember, it's a calling card of a Sousa march to really kind of lean on those half steps down, and it really adds a lot of charm to this melody when you do that. So that's the Stars and Stripes incorrectly. Now we're going to play it correctly for you with all the things we just talked about.
As you can hear, the trio is just a simple melody and should be contoured like one. Make sure to play the last 4 measures of the trio, the downbeats, make sure to play them nice and crisp because that sets up the Dogfight section. We're going to continue with the Stars and Stripes Forever because it has a fantastic Dogfight section. Here it is incorrectly first. The Dogfight section is typically the loudest, most raucous part of a Sousa march. It should be played very deliberately in a molto marcato style. Don't forget the treatment of the dotted rhythms to delay and de-emphasize the second note. This crisp style of playing is very necessary for the clarity in the ensemble. Oftentimes, the entire brass section will be playing the same rhythms in the Dogfight. And if we were to play very long sounds, then it would get very muddy. Also typical of Sousa's Dogfight sections is harmonic development. Make sure you lead each one of those brief statements to their harmonic arrival points. This can be done mostly with dynamic contrast. Sometimes conductors choose to slow down just before a grandioso strain or the last strain of Sousa's marches. Make sure you keep those notes just as clear and just as well articulated in that molto marcato style. Oftentimes, the trio melody will be reprised in the last strain of a Sousa march. We decided to go with Sousa's Golden Jubilee to display the difference between the beauty of the trio in the actual trio section and then the marcato style played with in the last strain. Listen now as we play it incorrectly from the trio through the last strain, no repeats.
When you play it sostenuto like this, it's just absolutely exhausting. So let's talk about a few things we can do to, number one, make it more march-like, and number two, make it easier to play on the chops especially. So the first thing is, if you had to compare the grandioso strain, or this last strain, to any of the previous strains or sections of the march we've already talked about, I think it would be closest in orchestration and style to the second strain, okay? So that you want to play the last strain in a marcato style, a very grandioso style. So the delayed on the dotted rhythms, the attack and decay on the long notes like we've talked about before, really a big boisterous sound. Of course, just like the second strain, you'll be doubling the trombones and trumpets, and that's the main texture that the conductor is going to want to hear. So again, you're just adding resonance to what they're doing. Apart from that, it's pretty straightforward from there to the end. So let's play it now with all the right characteristics. So a lot different. And again, what you really want the march to end with is this really bombastic, fun style to make the audience just clap along all the way to the last beat of the march. So the last thing we'd like to talk to you about today is the 6/8 march. Now, pretty much every stylistic guideline that we've already mentioned applies to a 6/8 march just like it applies to a cut time march. However, there's one rhythmic figure that kind of is a little bit different in a 6/8 march that really doesn't come up in the cut time march, because in a 6/8 march you're dealing with subdivisions of 3, and that figure is a quarter note, eighth note figure. So if we were to look at it and basically sing it rhythmically, it would sound like dum da dum da dum da dum. Almost has a swung feel to it, but that's the last thing we want to do in a march, because we definitely don't want it to sound jazzy at all, because it's the polar opposite of that. So what we want to do is play a little bit delayed, and so we're going to play it first incorrectly for you, and then I'll finish what I'm saying. What we're going to use here for our first example is the Bride-Elect March by John Philip Sousa, and we're going to be playing the intro, first and second strain, no repeats, incorrectly. pretty swingy. So the first thing, as I was mentioning before, we want to do is on the quarter note, eighth note pairing, dun, da, dun, da, dun. We want to delay the eighth note, all right? Almost making it a duple figure. I heard the saying one time that it's like when a person with a really heavy New York City accent says the word today, today, all right? Just a very short ta and a very heavy day, today. And again, just like in the duple marches, it de-emphasizes the eighth note and re-emphasizes the next downbeat across the bar line. We always want to have the momentum across the bar line. Also, this applies to the eighth note pickup note. So when you have an eighth note pickup note and then eighth notes after that, like da 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 dum. You have a little delay, da 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 dum, just like that. Again, accentuating the following downbeat. So let's play this, and we'll see what it sounds like with the new characteristics.
And because 1/6/8 march just isn't enough, we decided to put on also King Cotton. This time we're just going to play it correctly. We're going to play the intro, first strain, and second strain. Remember that the guidelines that we discussed here today are simply that, general guidelines. They must be applied with good taste. It's up to all of us to record our practice sessions, to study scores, and to listen to high-quality professional recordings that we enjoy. Thank you so much for joining us today, and Semper Fi.